The moment the paper touched the table, I understood this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. My brother didn't raise his voice, and no one reacted. That was what made it feel different. The invoice was printed and totaled before it ever reached me. My name is Kira Lawson. I am 25 years old. You owe this family $13,000 in back rent, Evan said, tapping the number once as if I might miss it. First payment is due this Saturday, he added. If you don't pay, you're not staying here. This is how real life works. Kira, he said. He had taken over handling the finances a few months earlier, and since then, he spoke in a way that sounded less like a brother and more like someone explaining terms. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the page instead. The breakdown didn't make much sense, but that wasn't what held my attention. It was the small printed line in the corner. The date. It showed the invoice had been prepared days before I brought my things back into the house. Across from me, my mother took a sip of her drink and set the glass down carefully. We're charging interest now, she said, calm and measured. 13% monthly. Like a real landlord. Like a real landlord. No one laughed. No one questioned it. The room stayed quiet in a way that felt settled, not tense. As if everyone already understood their role in what was happening, I traced the edge of the paper once, trying to understand how long it had been waiting for me. Evan leaned back slightly in his chair, watching me, not asking anything, just waiting. Back rent, I said, finally, keeping my voice even. From when you started living here without contributing, he replied, without hesitation. That answer came too quickly. It sounded practiced. I nodded once, more to myself than to him, and looked down at the invoice again. The numbers, the date, the way it had been presented, it all fit together in a way that didn't leave much room for misunderstanding. It wasn't about rent. It was about control. I folded the paper in half and set it beside my plate, and for the first time since I sat down, I stopped trying to make sense of what they were saying and started paying attention to what they were doing. I stayed at the table a little longer than I needed to, not because I was thinking about agreeing, but because I wanted to understand what I had just been handed. There were charges that didn't connect to anything real, utilities that were higher than they had ever been, maintenance that no one had mentioned, and small additions that looked harmless on their own but added up quickly when you stopped skimming. Evan watched me read, his attention steady, like he expected a certain reaction and was waiting for it to arrive. When I didn't give him one, he leaned forward slightly and said, "The first payment is due this week. I already worked it into what we have coming up." What we have coming up. The way he said it didn't match the situation he was presenting. If this was about fairness, there wouldn't be a schedule already built around it. That kind of phrasing belonged to something else. Something planned around a need, not a principle. My mother nodded as if that explained everything. It's about responsibility, she said, her tone calm but firm. You're old enough to understand that now. I didn't respond right away. I let the words sit there, not because I agreed with them, but because I was starting to see how they fit into the rest of the evening. Nothing about this felt spontaneous. People don't invent numbers like that unless they're trying to solve something fast. I looked down at the page again, this time less focused on what it said and more on why it existed at all. The total wasn't the point. It was the urgency behind it, the way everything seemed to be pushing toward a deadline I hadn't been told about. Evan tapped the table once, not impatient, just certain. We need this handled now. Kira. We need this handled before Friday. Kira, he said, or we'll have to make changes here. You've been treated like family long enough, he added. Now it's time to be accountable. That was the first time he said need instead of owe. And once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I didn't argue. Evan paused, like he had prepared for something louder. He had already positioned himself for it, leaning forward slightly, ready to explain, correct, or escalate, depending on how I reacted. When I didn't, He had nowhere to go. "You understand this isn't optional," he added, his tone tightening just enough to fill the silence I left behind. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and let my hands rest on the table so he could see they weren't shaking. That seemed to bother him more than anything I could have said. Across from me, my mother stayed composed, her expression steady in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. She didn't interrupt him this time, and when she finally spoke, it was only to reinforce what had already been decided. "This is how things work," she said, like she was explaining something simple instead of something that didn't add up. I looked between them without rushing, taking in the way they sat, the way they avoided looking uncertain, the way everything about their posture suggested this conversation had already been finished before it started. Once they decide who you are, they stop needing facts. So I didn't defend myself. I let them keep talking, and for the first time, it felt less like I was part of the conversation and more like I was watching it from the outside. I let the silence sit a little longer before I spoke, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting to the way they expected. The invoice was still open in front of me, the paper slightly creased where I had folded it earlier, and I turned it just enough to look at the corner again. "The date on this," I said, keeping my voice even. It was printed before I moved back in. I gave the words time to land the way they would, without pushing them any further. Evan answered too quickly. "That doesn't matter. It's just when I put it together." He leaned forward slightly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." When I finally looked at him, he was already shifting in his chair, his posture less settled than it had been before. The confidence was still there, but it didn't sit as comfortably as it had a few minutes earlier. "It matters a little," I said, not pressing, just stating it plainly, because it means this wasn't based on anything that actually happened after I got here. My mother set her glass down with a small, controlled motion. "You're focusing on the wrong detail," she said. "The point is that you've been here, and you haven't contributed." The way she said point made it clear she wasn't interested in the timeline, only the conclusion. I nodded again, slower this time, and let my eyes drop back to the page. I didn't argue about the numbers, and I didn't explain what I knew didn't match. I just left the question where it was, unanswered in a way that couldn't be ignored. Truth doesn't need to be loud to change a room. Evan exhaled through his nose. A quiet sound, but enough to show the shift. He didn't tap the table this time. He didn't repeat the total. For the first time that night, he didn't seem entirely certain about what came next. I didn't say anything else after that. The conversation continued behind me, but it no longer felt directed at me. I picked up the invoice, folded it once more, and left it on the table before walking upstairs without asking permission or announcing where I was going. My room looked the same at first, but small changes made it clear I didn't belong there anymore. The drawer where I kept small personal things had been reorganized, and not carefully. I opened my closet and reached for a bag, taking only what I knew I would need without thinking too much about it. You don't realize how little you need until you stop trying to stay. For a moment, I thought about staying, about agreeing to part of it, just to keep things from turning into something worse. Then I looked at the paper again, and the thought passed. Downstairs. I could still hear their voices, steady and controlled, like nothing had shifted at all. No one came up to check on me, and no one called my name. When I came back down, the invoice was still where I had left it. Evan glanced at me, but he didn't stop me, and my mother didn't look up this time. I walked past the table, past the door, and out into the night air without hesitation. Leaving didn't feel like losing. It felt like seeing clearly. And the clearest part was this. They thought I would come back the same way I had before. The first night away. I didn't try to explain anything to myself. I just found a place to stay and let the quiet settle in without filling it. It wasn't until the next morning, when everything felt more ordinary again, that I started going over what had actually happened. I opened my banking app out of habit, then stayed on it longer than I needed to, One transfer led to another until I was further back than I expected. I started recognizing the reasons behind each one. A repair that couldn't wait, a bill that had been missed, a situation that had been described as temporary and handled quietly. That was the part that stayed with me. I wasn't tracking it then, and I wasn't expecting anything back. It had always seemed easier to step in than to let things fall apart. You tell yourself it's helping, and you don't stop to ask what it's costing you. By the time I closed the app, I wasn't thinking about the $13,000 anymore. I was thinking about how long the pattern had been there without me naming it. Later that day, I met Nina at a small cafe near her office. She worked in compliance, which meant she spent most of her time looking at things that didn't quite add up until they did. I told her what had happened in a straightforward way, leaving out anything that sounded like emotion and sticking to what I could verify. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back slightly. "That's not a disagreement," she said. "That's structure." I looked at her, not immediately following. Structure for what? For getting money out of you without calling it that. She said, just as evenly, the invoice, the timing, the pressure it's designed. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. The worst part wasn't what they did. It was how normal it had become. I sat there for a moment longer, letting that settle into something I could hold on to, and for the first time since I left the house, I stopped trying to make sense of their version of things and started trusting my own. I didn't start gathering everything all at once. It happened in pieces over a few days, whenever I had time to sit down without distractions and go back through what I had overlooked before. The records were easy to find. I had never hidden anything, and I had never expected to need it later. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, old messages that explained why something had been urgent at the time. I moved through them carefully. Dates and amounts mattered. The order mattered more than I realized at first. The notes made the pattern clearer than before. None of it had been random. It had followed a rhythm I hadn't questioned while I was in it. When you stop rushing, things start to line up on their own. By the third day, I had everything organized into a simple list. I wasn't trying to build a case to present to them, and I wasn't thinking about how they would respond. I just needed to see it in one place, without interruption or explanation. When I added the numbers together, the total came out higher than $13,000, but in the opposite direction. I didn't react to that the way I thought I might. There was no sense of satisfaction and no immediate anger, just a steady understanding of what had actually happened. I leaned back and looked at the screen for a moment longer, then closed it without saving anything new. The information was already there. It didn't need to be arranged into something more convincing than it already was. Evidence doesn't argue. It just waits. By then, I knew that if I went back, it wouldn't be to correct them. It would be to decide how much of this I was still willing to carry. A week after I left, my phone started ringing early in the morning, and when I checked it, I saw Evan's name repeated more times than usual. The message he left was short, which told me more than anything he could have explained. "Call me. It's urgent." I waited before calling back, not to make a point, but because I wanted to hear him clearly, without reacting to the urgency first. When he answered, his voice was tighter than I remembered, like he was holding something together while speaking. "There's a problem with the loan," he said. "It's tied to the house. The payment was over $20,000, and it didn't go through. They gave a deadline, and I missed it." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "That was enough. A rejected payment like that doesn't reset. It triggered consequences that moved forward whether you were ready or not." "What kind of loan?" I asked. "Home equity." "I've been restructuring it," he said quickly. "If this isn't corrected today, it goes into default review." I leaned back slightly, already understanding the situation. He had taken control of something that required precision, and he had handled it like everything else, fast, confident, and without checking the details that actually mattered. "Who handled this before?" I asked. There was a pause. "You did." That was the first honest answer he had given me. They rejected it because of how it was submitted. I said. That means it's under review now. Yeah, he said, quieter. I need you to look at it. He didn't sound like he was asking for help the way people usually do. He sounded like someone who had run out of options. They didn't need me when they had control. They needed me when they lost it. I ended the call and sat there for a moment, not thinking about whether I would help, but about how quickly everything had shifted once they couldn't manage it on their own. I went back to the house later that day, not because I felt pulled toward it, but because I had already decided how I was going to handle what came next. The front door was unlocked, and when I stepped inside, the air felt different from the night I left, quieter in a way that didn't come from calm. Evan was already waiting in the living room with a stack of papers spread across the table. He stood up when he saw me, but he didn't move closer. My mother stayed seated, her hands folded in front of her, watching without speaking. "I've got everything here," he said, gesturing to the documents. "We just need to fix the submission, and I didn't sit down right away." I looked at the papers first, then at him. "Let me see what you sent," I said. He hesitated, then handed them over, and that pause told me more than the documents would. I went through the pages carefully, following the timeline, the method of payment, the confirmation notices. It didn't take long to see where it had gone wrong. There was an email printed on top of the stack. The subject line was clear enough: payment rejected, action required. "You used the wrong channel for the transfer," I said, setting one of the pages aside. It wasn't routed the way the agreement requires, so they rejected it and flagged the account. Evan exhaled, sharper this time. "Okay, but we can fix that now." "Right, we can correct it," I said. "But that doesn't remove what already happened." He nodded quickly, like he was trying to stay ahead of the part he didn't want to deal with. "That's fine. Just tell me what to do." I set the documents down and reached into my bag, pulling out the folder I had put together over the past few days. I placed it on the table between us and opened it without explaining. "These are my records," I said, turning the pages so he could see them. "Transfers, dates, reasons, everything I've covered over the past year." He looked at the numbers, then at me, then back at the numbers again. "That's not what this is about," he said, his voice tightening. "It is," I replied, just as steady. "Because you asked me to pay $13,000 for something that doesn't exist, while this does." My mother shifted in her chair but didn't interrupt. "They didn't want the truth," I said, more to the space between us than to either of them. They wanted the outcome without the cost. Evan didn't respond right away. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't try to correct what I said or redirect it into something else. The conversation had changed, and this time, I wasn't the one being explained. I stayed long enough to make sure the immediate problem didn't get worse, but not long enough to take it over completely. I showed Evan what needed to be corrected, walked him through the steps, and made it clear where the responsibility shifted back to him once the submission was fixed. He followed what I said without arguing, which was new, but it didn't feel like agreement as much as necessity. The lender accepted the corrected payment, but the delay had already triggered penalties, and the terms of the agreement were no longer as flexible as they had been before. There were conditions now, stricter timelines, less room for error. My mother didn't try to reframe anything this time. She moved more carefully around the conversation, as if she understood that saying the wrong thing would only make the distance clearer. Evan spoke less, and when he did, it was direct, without the tone he used to rely on. Respect doesn't always come from understanding. Sometimes it comes from losing the ability to ignore something. I didn't bring up the invoice again, and neither did they. It didn't need to be resolved out loud. It had already been replaced by something more concrete, something they couldn't explain away. Before I left, I gathered my things without rushing, the same way I had the first time, but it felt different now. The house looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way it held everything that had happened inside it. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped holding it together. If there's anything I would say to someone who finds themselves in a situation like this, it's that clarity matters more than comfort, even when it comes late. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fixing what's breaking, but deciding what you're no longer responsible for. When I reached the door, no one stopped me this time. Not because they didn't notice, because they knew they couldn't. I walked out again without hesitation, and this time, I didn't expect anything behind me to change.